Hello, everyone. I hope your week is off to a good start, and I also hope that your data collection for the final project is going well. Let me share my screen with you, and we're going to talk about qualitative research methods today. So far, we have focused on quantitative research methods such as experiments, surveys, and content analysis. But now we're going to talk about interviews, focus groups, and ethnography. How are qualitative research methods different from quantitative research methods? So, unlike quantitative research methods that focus on numbers, in qualitative research, what we focus on are words. We're interested not in measuring people's attitudes or opinions, but we are more interested in their subjective viewpoints. We're interested to see what an individual thinks, and we want to see how people behave in groups, in a specific cultural context. So, our focus is to capture their subjective views. Qualitative research methods have one big advantage in comparison to quantitative research methods, and that is that they provide an in depth understanding of issues. You remember when we talked about surveys, how we talked about being able to collect data about people's attitudes or beliefs or opinions. But then on the other hand, we kind of miss describing the context. So survey data are not likely to provide some context of the issue we want to study. So this is where qualitative research plays an important role. It gives us an opportunity to explain and understand the context of events or issues in the society. Reporting does not use tables or graphs to illustrate data like we do in quantitative research, but rather it uses participants' language. So if you look at a qualitative study, you will see a bunch of quote blocks and things like that portraying people's perceptions of certain phenomena. Another important difference is that sampling in this case is judgmental. So we're not looking to randomly select people. We are trying to see who are the people that would best uh, help us answer research questions, who are the people that we should interview or include in our focus groups to collect data. Another important aspect of qualitative research is that in this case, we don't start with a theory and then test a hypothesis. Instead, we collect data, and most of the time, not necessarily, theories emerge from research rather than being a starting point. Now, let's introduce some major qualitative research methods. One of them are interviews. In communication research, this is a method of data collection through a question answer session that happens between a researcher or a respondent or an informant. So you will hear about these two concepts in qualitative research, informants and respondents, and let me just explain the difference between them. Informants are people who can talk both about themselves and others. So let's say you're, for example, a journalist working in a big news organization in New York City. So could you be an informant if we're talking about, if your research focuses on the newsroom rituals, then that person could certainly be an informant because they would be able to talk both about themselves and they would be able to talk about other people in the newsroom, such as their editors or other journalists. Respondents can only talk about themselves. Journalists could just be respondents. It really depends on your topic. So if we're talking about the topic where they can describe other people, talk about them, and also talk about themselves, that they could serve as informants. But if we're talking about people who, if we're talking about the people who can only talk about themselves but cannot really discuss other people in that environment that you're studying, then we're calling them respondents. Interviews are designed to elicit information that a researcher is interested in. So let's take a look at the structure of interviews. There are several different types of interviews. They could be unstructured. In this case, there are no predetermined questions. With semi-structured interviews, and this is the form that I use in my research frequently. Semi-structure basically allow you to ask broad questions, but then you can also ask follow-ups. So there are certain concepts that I would organize my questions around, and I would ask questions, but then depending on their answers, I will certainly ask follow-ups, where I will add new questions if I feel that this person could reveal something more about the topic that I'm studying. With fully structured interviews, there is a predetermined list of questions that follows a specific order. So there's a list of questions, there's the order of the question. You basically go from one person to another and ask the same questions. And you also ask those questions in a specific order. Of course, in this case, if there's a need for clarification, if the person doesn't respond clearly to your question, then you could rephrase the question or ask a follow-up just to make sure that your question is answered. So it doesn't mean like you just stick to that list of questions and never ask them a follow-up. No, you can still ask a follow-up if you feel that your question needs to be further clarified. They're just more structured, that semi-structured interviews that allow you for more questions to ask, more follow-ups. Also, your questions do not need to be asked in a specific order if you feel that conversation is going in a certain way, where you would rather ask question 7 before question 3 and so on. So it just gives you more flexibility than fully structured interviews. If we look at question types for interviews, we could distinguish between or among descriptive questions. These questions usually ask informants to describe phenomena. So one such example is, how do you spend your leisure time? So they would talk about it. They would describe their free time and how they spend it. You could ask, of course, both informants and respondents to answer this question. When it comes to structural questions, they basically explain the relationship among the terms that informants use. One example of such a question would be, would you explain what kind of exercises do you perform as part of your healthy lifestyle routine? You see, I frequently give some examples that are related to my life, because when I think about examples to give you, I usually go over the things that I do, which is exercising, running, reading, and doing journalism or doing research on journalism. So that's why you will see a lot of examples that reflect what I do. The reason for this is just that because I try to think of my own examples, and they usually come from my own experience. So that's why they're related to exercising, running, or journalism, or intercultural communication, which is something that I'm also interested in deeply. So let's take a look at a different form of question. They are called contrast questions. So what does it mean? When you're having a conversation, it allows you basically to ask a question that would determine certain differences between concepts. So let's say that this person mentioned that part of their exercise routine is jogging and running and lifting weights and so on. And then you go back to that question and you say something like, you mentioned that jogging and running were part of your exercise routine. Could you just explain the difference between the two? So that would be a contrast question. One of the things that could happen during the interview is that they don't respond to a question for different reasons. Maybe they just don't feel comfortable around you, or they're aloof, or they don't understand the question well. So, in that case, try to ask follow ups that would elicit more information, or try to rephrase your question. Ask if you think that your question needs to be answered and you feel like the respondent did not answer your question, then simply just rephrase it, try to ask a follow up to make sure that your question is answered. So, one such example include tell me more, or could you please describe this in detail? So, you could ask just questions like that to make sure that they're responding to your questions. Now, aside from interviews, if we want to interview groups of people instead of going from one person to another, if we want to study group interaction, if we want to see how groups of people react to an ad, for example, then we would rather uh, conduct a focus group than interviews. This method is very important in qualitative research because it allows us to elicit ideas from a small group of people. What we usually do, we set up a few focus groups, and they're comprised of 6 to 12 people. And when setting up a focus group, it is important to have a moderator. That person would basically be in charge of asking questions and making sure that everyone in the room participates in that discussion. As a researcher, you could be on the side and just take notes on people's answers, on people's interactions. Sometimes the moderator could also be the person who is doing this research, but it would be nice to have a moderator and then a researcher who is observing thoroughly all the participants and taking notes. The assumption in this case is that ideas that emerge from several people would be of greater quality and diversity than ideas collected in interviews. So basically, when people start responding to questions, if person A says something and then that person could actually elicit an idea from the person number two, from person B. So it's basically when we talk, we kind of listen to other people, and then when they say something, we also come up with certain ideas. So that is different in comparison to you just answering somebody's questions in individual interviews. So basically, it just also we will encounter a diversity of viewpoints, which is another big benefit of focus groups. What is important to take into consideration when conducting focus groups? So first of all, members represent a defined demographic groups. So what does it mean? Would you like to do focus groups on healthcare workers and their struggles during the pandemics? You need to really define: are you gonna do a focus group with nurses who worked night shifts and so on? So you really need to, during the COVID-19 pandemic, so you really need to figure out what is your demographic group. So they need to have something in common. So let's say these are nurses who do night shifts, who have been working at night during the pandemic. So that could be your defined focus group. So they have to have something similar. They have similar knowledge, but then on the other hand, another thing that you want to happen is that these people have divergent views, and then you will look at their different experiences, and you will also try to find something in common and discuss it in your research study. The discussion should be relaxed. So for people to share their honest viewpoints, you really need to make sure to have a moderator who is engaging, who makes sure that everyone participates, who can create an atmosphere where people um, are ready to share their viewpoints, to share their opinions. Another thing is that focus groups are usually audio or video recorded. So you just need to tell the participants ahead of time whether you're going to video record them or audio record them. And of course, they need to sign an informed consent to be audio or video recorded. The group moderator or facilitator should listen attentively, maintain focus, refrain from expressing views. So don't, or if you're a researcher who is also moderator, just refrain to expressing your views, listen to them, ask them questions, ask follow-ups when needed, ask them to clarify, and ensure that everyone participates. Aside from conducting focus groups in person, you could also conduct online focus groups. So you could do this in multiple ways. You could create like a chat group and just gather people and let them share their opinions, or you could do an online focus group by setting up a Zoom meeting and then having people participate in a focus group. Some of the advantages of this research method is that this you could conduct a focus group at low cost. You know, when we talk about focus groups that happen in person, frequently you need to provide some incentives. Some incentive for those people participating in a focus group, so such as gift cards, because they're still they usually run for about 2 hours, so people need to spend 2 hours with you and participate in that discussions. So it is kind of difficult to convince them to do it for free. For that reason, online focus group, and then you also need to find the space where you'll conduct these focus groups and provide some refreshments and so on. So in those terms, even though in case of online focus groups, you should also provide some incentives, but you don't need to worry about the space or refreshments or food and things like that. So for that reason, it is cheaper than conducting a focus group in person. But then, on the other hand, you're missing some important interactions, and especially if you're conducting a focus group through a chat platform, then there's this absence of nonverbal in-person communication. Online focus groups are also time saving, so you don't need to worry about like setting up everything and waiting for people to come. So it's way easier to conduct it online. Another great benefit is that this links people internationally. You can have diverse participants from all over the world. It offers anonymity, so maybe this will make people be more open to share their ideas. They can run for days or weeks if necessary, and it's convenient for everyone to participate from home. When it comes to disadvantages, aside from this absence of nonverbal communication, there's a problem sometimes interpreting typed messages when people are not clear, or when people don't use, interpunction or something that would make their sentences confusing. There's a problem with anonymity of participants. You feel like you're not sure who is actually talking. You're confused about the people participating in that group. Or when we're talking about focus groups that are being conducted over chat platforms, problems interpreting virtual beings such as the avatars, and connection speed in some case may limit participation or keyboard skills. So there are certain disadvantages, but still online focus groups are becoming more and more popular. Now, another research method that I wanted to discuss with you, and this research method basically, in a way, incorporates all these methods that we previously discussed. So, ethnography is a study of human social behavior and cultures. It involves observing, describing, and interpreting people's behavior. It is important when performing this method to do it in a natural setting. The researcher wants to understand the culture's shared meanings and explain its norms. What is important to do when conducting an ethnography? You will be observing, interviewing people, and use archival data to explain the phenomenon that you are studying. You could also use focus groups to conduct ethnography. Some important things, let's say you want to do an ethnography in a major marketing company. So what is it that you need to do? So I said marketing company instead of a newsroom. So what is it that you need to do before going there? First of all, you need to define research questions clearly. Another thing, identify potential gatekeepers and informants. So gatekeepers in this case would probably be managers or CEO or whoever is occupies like one of the top positions in the company. You really need to talk to them because they should give you permission to talk to other people inside a company, to talk to the employees of that company. So make sure to identify them, create a list. You need to uh, obtain IRB approval for your study, and you also need to have informed consents collected from those people you are interviewing. And decide whether you want to interview people individually or you want to interview them in groups. Choose between structured and unstructured interview, and of course decide what you want. What is it that you want to observe? Do you want to observe how people communicate with each other inside a company? Do you want to observe their daily rituals? So what are the things that you're actually observing? What is the most important to you? Or are you interested just in interaction between females and males in the company, like how they communicate, how like this intergender communication occurs inside that company. So you need to really focus on a specific thing and decide what is it that you're going to observe, and how you're going to record, analyze, and present this data. When it comes to ethnographic studies, it is important to know how to take notes. So I would suggest focusing on three types of notes. So first, you will have descriptive notes. They present the raw data of human interaction in the setting that are the focus of the ethnography, just the classic notes that you're taking. Method notes, when you collect data, just make sure to note which method you use for each set of data. And analytic notes, they basically, you will write them to interpret raw data. When it comes to the starting point of your study, so after you figure out which research questions are you going to ask, which methods you're going to use, who is it that you're going to interview for your study, you really need to see what specifically you're going to study. Speech community, speech situation, or going to study speech event, communicative act, communicative style, or ways of speaking. So we usually focus on one of these things to study. And how are you going to study there? So there's one scholar who listed questions that you should develop when conducting an ethnography, and the scholar called it speaking. So it actually reflects the units that you're supposed to study. So what are these units? So what is it that you need to describe in detail when conducting an ethnography? First of all, it is a situation or the setting where this event or phenomenon is taking place, participants or individuals involved, and their goals of communication, acts or language that they use and how they behave. Key reflects the tone of speech. So this is one of the units that you should analyze, the tone of their speech. Instrumentality, methods of communication, how they communicate. Is it in person, or do they communicate over online chat apps? Norms, the rules that govern the speech and generous types of speech. Ethnography could also be performed online, not just in person, and this type of ethnography is called nethnography. It allows the researcher to interpret data such as avatars, emoticons, blogs, hyperlinks, and so on. So I want to ask you, if we compare like the traditional ethnography with online ethnography, what is the difference between the two? And what is it that you would like to study online? What is it that you could study online that you cannot study in person? So just think of social media platforms and how people interact there. It could be doing like observing that, or interviewing people who are, regular Instagram users, and see how they behave in an online community would be an interesting study. So that's it's you don't only need to study social media. You could study other things, such as the people who post comments on news websites and so on. But one of the main components of ethnography is doing an observation. So what does it mean? I just need to distinguish between ethnography and observation. So basically, ethnography incorporates different methods, different qualitative research methods to collect data. On the other hand, observation, this is like a single method. So basically, in this case, we want to record and interpret individual and group behaviors in their natural setting. Every observation is part of ethnography. So it is an integral part. But when we do ethnography, aside from observations, we could also do interviews and collect archival data and so on. In case of ethnography, it is a single study, so it basically not every observational study is ethnography. We don't have all this data that ethnography would allow us to collect. When we're doing an observational study, that we can do it in different ways. We could totally document people's behavior without them being aware of it. We could just observe them and write a study, and this is what you will do for an exercise that I prepare for you. But you could also participate. In this case, when you're performing a participatory observation, you're basically deeply involved with people in a specific environment. So you're one of the participants. You could go to a newsroom, do an observation, but if you want to be a participant, you're actually supposed to engage in this process of news production, observe other people, but also participate in the process as if you were part of that newsroom. And that study would be incorporate participant observation data. What are some advantages and disadvantages of observational methods? One key advantage is that it explains attitudes and behavior in depth. It provides context. It allows access to participants' view of phenomena, provides insight and explanation. On the other hand, when it comes to disadvantages, they're reflected in difficulties to access participants, and also research outcomes are affected by researcher-participants' relationship. They could sometimes be good, and sometimes they could not be so good, and it would certainly affect the study and its results. And it could be time-consuming. When people do observations, it could run for weeks or months. When it comes to ethnography, these studies would run for years. So it is really, really time-consuming. But in order to understand another culture, in order to understand another company and its rituals and routine, you really need to spend some time there. You can't just make an observation in 2 days and develop a theory upon that, make some major conclusions. So you really need to spend time. And now, finally, our final component when it comes to qualitative research, as I mentioned, we are not using numbers. We are not using tables to illustrate these numbers. Instead, We're performing an analysis looking at words in context, keywords in context. We're trying to find common themes that emerge from our data. Let's say, I will give you an example. If you conduct a focus group and you ask people how they obtain information, trustworthy information about COVID-19 vaccines, and then they list several sources, you hear several of them listing their doctors. So then it's definitely, that would be one of the themes that emerge um, from your data, that basically doctors are perceived as trustworthy, reliable source among patients, and they rely on them for information about COVID-19 vaccine. What type of codes do we use when we conduct qualitative research? So now we're focusing on the analysis portion of qualitative research. Most analyses use categorization, and there are two forms of coding: fixed coding and flexible coding. Fixed coding assigns units of information to theoretically determined categories. So we have these categories: trustworthiness, and then they're clearly defined, clearly determined, and then we basically assign units to them. But when it comes to flexible coding, aside from these strictly defined categories, we could also add additional categories that would emerge from our research as we analyze it. So we just learned that, people also believe that trustworthy information come from social media sources carry a blue tick, so from verified accounts. And that could be something that we did not anticipate before we started collecting data. Another thing when it comes to analysis is that the research we're taking in qualitative, when we utilize qualitative methods, is the grounded theory approach. That means the theory will emerge from data. Again, if we go back to quantitative research, remember how we start with a specific theory. Usually, most of the time, we start with a specific theory, and then we analyze data. But in this case, theories frequently emerge from data. And one thing that you need to know is that there's you could find software to do this qualitative research study. So there are many out there. One of them is listed on this slide. It is computer-assisted qualitative data analysis software. There's other, as I mentioned, but you could use it. It really facilitates your data analysis. So let's take a look at the key concepts for this lecture. They include interviews, focus groups, ethnography observation, informants, respondents, coding, and nodes. So these are just key concepts. The research methods we covered today include interviews, focus groups, ethnography, and observation. And I was thinking about what kind of exercise to do. And this is an exercise that I think I gave to every group of students in my communication research course, and they really enjoyed it. The only difference is with some groups I had this observation. They did it in person, and you could actually, if you want to do it, you could do it in two. Some of them just went to observe people in a coffee shop or in a cafeteria. But as we are doing this class online, as because of all the restrictions that we face, I want you to do an online ethnography, online observation, not ethnography, but online observation. What you need to do is find a virtual group on social media. So you can find a Facebook group, or you could look at an ongoing debate. For instance, see what Twitter topics are trending, and if you could find like a debate on a certain issue, you could just focus on that and do an observation, see how people interact, see how people communicate with each other. Are they fired up? Are they mad? Are they expressing anger? Or are they happy about what's going on? So just do an observation, and in that observation, you will focus on the setting. So explain the setting, explain where this debate is taking place, explain the culture, the behavior of the people you're observing. That means that you will focus on the language and the meanings associated with specific phrases, communication, patterns, greetings, relationships among people, and so on. Take notes on quotes as well. So, all the things that I listed in this paragraph, it really looks if it applies to that specific thing that you're studying. When you're done, I want you to write an essay of about 400 to 450 words and post it under observation. I have an error. I see it now. Make sure to describe the setting you observed. Where did you do it? How many people were observed, etc. Identify commonalities and include some quotes in your observation if applicable. You could also add some screenshots as evidence. So add screenshots of tweets, for instance, if that's what you're studying. So I hope that this is clear, and I'm really looking forward to reading your observations. Please just submit them on time. And if you have any questions about this lecture or anything else, just send me an email. Thank you and have a great week. Bye.